The whole story takes back to around the year 2007, approximately 17 years ago. At that time, Nick had the chance to meet a girl named Nara at a county fair in the province where he lived. Nick got to know Nara through one of his close friends named Joy. When he first met Nara, he found her to be a very cute girl. However, since both Nick and Nara were too young to be in love at that time, they chose to remain good friends. As Nick reached around grade 7, he and Nara ended up attending the same school. Despite being in different classes, Nara was in the same class as Joy, the friend who had introduced them. Their relationship at that time was like any other classmates, but there was one subject that brought them together in the same classroom, and that was art. This was a crucial point that allowed Nick and Nara to get to know each other better. It started with Nara frequently asking Nick for help with her drawings because she wasn't very skilled in art. The assignments in their art class at that time involved drawing characters from favorite literary works. Nick's drawings for Nara earned her full marks, which impressed her greatly. In appreciation, Nara thanked Nick by saying, "Thank you, my Romeo." Throughout their time in the same school, Nara often tutored Nick in other subjects, and in return, Nick would draw for her art assignments. This exchange brought them closer together. By the end of grade 8, during the summer break, Nick wanted to work in Bangkok with his relatives to save money for a mobile phone. Nick accepted his relative's invitation to work in Bangkok. Once he had saved enough money, he bought a mobile phone and used it to call Nara every day. While Nick was still diligently working in Bangkok, a week before he was due to return to school, he continued his regular phone conversations with Nara. However, he noticed something unusual. Nara, who was usually cheerful, had become noticeably quieter. When Nick returned home to his province, he immediately called Nara. This time, she asked him to visit her at her house. Nara usually lived with her grandmother, and their house was surrounded by vast rice fields. Upon hearing her request, Nick agreed and quickly went to see her. When he arrived at Nara's house, they talked for a while. During this conversation, they decided to start dating. About 6 days into their relationship, Nick learned that Nara's grandmother would stay at the temple on important Buddhist holidays. Because of this, Nara asked Nick to stay with her that night. Nick agreed and stayed over at Nara's house. The next morning, after waking up, he returned to his own home. That evening, Nick called Nara as usual. Around 9 p.m., Nara suddenly asked Nick to meet her at a place about 10 kilometers from Nick's village, near the market and their school. When Nick arrived, he saw Nara waiting on her motorcycle. She then led him down a path lined with sugarcane fields until they reached a hut in the middle of the fields. Nara parked her motorcycle and invited Nick to sit with her in the hut. Under the moonlight in the quiet of the sugarcane fields, Nick noticed a worried look in Nara's eyes. Before she could say anything, she suddenly broke down in tears. Nick asked her what was wrong, but she wouldn't answer. He could only comfort her, unsure of what was causing her distress. After about 20 minutes of crying, Nara calmed down and asked, "Can you take me home?" Nick agreed and drove her back to her house. They parted ways, leaving Nick puzzled about what had upset her. The next day, Sunday, Nick was busy helping his parents at the farm and didn't get a chance to call Nara. On Monday morning, Nick went to school as usual but noticed that Nara wasn't there. Concerned, he asked Joy, Nara's classmate, but neither Nick nor Joy had seen her at school that day. That same evening after school, Nick drove to Nara's house, but it was closed and silent as if no one was home. Nick continued visiting her house every day and tried calling her constantly, but Nara never answered. 5 days later, as Nick was heading to school in the morning, he saw Joy approaching with another girl. Nick recognized the girl as the daughter of the village headman where Nara lived. Joy asked Nick if he knew that Nara had hanged herself. Nick was shocked to the core. The girl with Joy then explained that earlier that morning, Nara's grandmother had asked the village headman for help to go to a specific location. The grandmother mentioned that the police had called Nara's father, informing him that a child had hanged herself and a phone was found at the scene. They needed someone to identify the body. The reason Nick hadn't found anyone at Nara's house was that Nara had been missing for several days. Nara's father had sent money for the grandmother to hire people to search for her. Upon hearing this, Nick immediately left school and headed to Nara's house, only to find it empty once again. He didn't know where Nara's grandmother was. Then something prompted Nick to think of the hut where Nara had taken him that night. He decided to drive to the hut. As he approached, he noticed multiple tire tracks on the road leading to the hut. He also immediately sensed that something terrible had happened there because a strong stench of decay filled the air. Upon arriving at the hut, Nick decided to go inside. There, he found traces of bodily fluids all over the floor, leading him to believe that this was where Nara had ended her life. But deep down, he didn't want to believe his own eyes and thoughts, praying it wasn't her. Suddenly, Nick heard the sound of a motorcycle arriving and someone walking up to the hut. As he sat there crying, he looked up to see a police officer who appeared surprised to see Nick. The officer asked, "What are you doing here?" Then, noticing something odd, he continued, "Who are you? What are you doing here? Don't you know someone died here?" Nick, in his distress, asked for a description of the deceased. The officer provided a brief description, and it confirmed Nick's worst fears. The deceased was indeed Nara. The police officer then asked Nick about his relationship with the deceased. Nick explained that they had just started dating recently. The officer continued his questioning. "Did you have any arguments with the deceased?" The conversation felt like an interrogation, but Nick, wanting to clear his name, recounted everything and showed the officer the messages he had exchanged with Nara. Satisfied that Nick was not involved, the officer ceased his questioning. After the police officer finished his questioning, Nick drove away with him and decided to stop by Nara's house again, hoping to find her grandmother and get some answers about what had happened. He parked his car and waited outside the house for a while, feeling lost and devastated by the loss of his girlfriend. Before long, Nara's grandmother returned home. As soon as she saw Nick, she burst into tears and embraced him, knowing he was the closest person to Nara at that time. That day, Nick stayed with Nara's grandmother until the evening, waiting for Nara's parents, who were on their way home. That day, Grandma began to tell everyone the whole story. The first person to discover Nara's body was the owner of the sugarcane farm. On the day of the incident, it was the scheduled day for the harvest. However, when the owner drove up to the hut, he heard a sound resembling someone being inside. At that moment, he didn't think much of it because the hut was often used by teenagers as a hangout spot. But as the noise persisted, he decided to go in and check. There, he found the body of a young girl hanging from the wooden beam, struggling as if begging for his help. At that moment, the farm owner quickly ran over to grab her legs and tried to lift her up to free her from the rope. However, things didn't go as planned. As he was lifting the girl's legs, he was hit by a strong smell of decay. When he looked at his arms, which were holding the girl's legs, he saw that they were covered in pus seeping from her body. But that wasn't all. The farm owner continued his story, saying that he felt something drop onto his head. When he looked up, he saw the decomposing body of the girl, with pieces of her insides falling and hitting his head. What was even more horrifying was the sight of the girl's face. Her eyes were wide open, her tongue was swollen and sticking out, and her face was bloated. She was staring directly at him and, in a faint voice, said, "Uncle, help me." Witnessing all of this caused the farm owner to go into shock and pass out immediately. Then his son found him lying there, holding the girl's body, with the head and torso of the corpse completely detached. Afterwards, the farm owner's son called the police and rescue team to investigate the scene. The authorities estimated that the deceased had been dead for at least 5 days. Upon hearing this, Nick recalled that the incident happened just one day after he and Nara had visited the hut. On that day, the police checked a mobile phone found at the scene and called Nara's father's number, which was saved in the phone. Nara's father then informed her grandmother to come and identify the body. After hearing the story, Nick still couldn't understand why Nara decided to end her life. He kept wondering if he could have done something to help if he had known why she was so upset that night. He deeply regretted not being able to prevent her tragic decision. Following Nara's death at the hut, the farm owner frequently dreamed of her. In these dreams, she asked him not to dismantle the hut because she had nowhere else to go. In return for granting her a place to stay, the farm owner asked for something in exchange. After these dreams, he often won the lottery, attributing his luck to Nara. Consequently, he decided to honor his promise and left the hut standing. Additionally, it was said that Nara's spirit was frequently seen by various people. Some reported seeing a girl resembling Nara walking along the roadside. When they stopped to ask where she was headed, she would suddenly vanish without a trace after a brief conversation. Others who went to the sugarcane farm to gather bamboo shoots often saw her hanging from the hut's beam. Years passed, but Nick was still haunted by the question of why Nara had taken her life. This question lingered until a significant event occurred in Nick's family while he was in his final year of high school. Nick had a younger sister named Pam, who was in her second year of high school. On the day of the incident, Pam was supposed to be working on a project at a friend's house until late. As her older brother, Nick volunteered to pick her up. However, when he arrived, Pam's friends told him that someone had already picked her up. Nick tried calling her, but her phone was turned off. Nick tried to remain optimistic, thinking perhaps another friend had given Pam a ride home. But when he returned home, his parents informed him that Pam had not come back yet, causing everyone in the house to panic. Both his parents went out searching for Pam at her friends' houses, while Nick rode his motorcycle to look for her in places he thought she might be, feeling that she was in danger because Pam never stayed out this late. While Nick was considering returning to the school to search for his sister, he suddenly remembered the hut where Nara had ended her life. He decided to change his route and headed towards that hut. When Nick arrived at the hut, he walked up to the spot where Nara's body had been found. Standing there, he said, "Nara, please help me find Pam. She's missing, and I don't know if she's safe or in danger." After he finished speaking, an inexplicable gust of wind swept through him, as if Nara had acknowledged his plea. Nick decided to leave the sugarcane farm and headed to the local police station to report Pam's disappearance. At the station, he encountered the same officer he had met at the farm years ago. The officer asked Nick for details about Pam's disappearance, but informed him that since she had been missing for less than 24 hours, they couldn't officially file a report yet. Then, suddenly, The officer recognized Nick and said, "Oh, I remember you now. You're the young man with a ghost on his back." Confused, Nick asked, "What ghost are you talking about, officer?" The officer then recounted what he had seen on the day of Nara's death at the hut. He explained that when he was climbing the stairs to inspect the scene, he saw Nick sitting and crying, with the figure of a young girl embracing him from behind. The officer shouted, asking what they were doing there, and the girl turned and smiled at him. As Nick stood up to approach the officer, the girl suddenly vanished. The officer had been momentarily stunned by the sight, which explained the strange expression Nick had noticed on his face during their first encounter. After talking with the police officer, Nick resumed his search for his sister. He decided to drive to the school, hoping someone there might have seen Pam, but no one had. As he pondered his next move, he suddenly remembered a place he hadn't checked yet. A desolate road along an irrigation canal known to be quite isolated. When Nick arrived, his motorcycle began to sputter and eventually stalled. He tried repeatedly to restart it, but it wouldn't start. Frustrated, he stopped trying and began scanning the area. He decided to explore on foot, heading towards a gravel road near the railway tracks close to the canal. It was dark by then, so Nick planned to take a quick look before returning. As he walked, a passing train's lights illuminated something nearby. Upon closer inspection, Nick saw a motorcycle. He approached it and realized it belonged to an older student he knew. This puzzled Nick, as the location was far from the seniors' village. Nick's curiosity grew. He wondered why the senior would be in such a remote area. Continuing to investigate, he felt an increasing sense of urgency, hoping this lead might somehow be connected to Pam's whereabouts. Nick walked through the tall grass in the area, using the light from the passing train and guided by a strange premonition. Finally, he found his sister, Pam, disheveled and hugging her knees while sobbing uncontrollably. Without hesitation, Nick ran to her, calling out and trying to bring her back to her senses. It seemed Pam was in a state of shock, barely aware of her surroundings. As Nick tried to comfort his sister, he kept looking around, alert for any sign of the perpetrator, but saw no one. After a while, Pam's crying subsided, and she lost consciousness. Nick took off his jacket to cover her and struggled to carry her out of the tall grass. Reaching the road, Nick noticed the senior's motorcycle still parked where he had seen it earlier. While carrying his unconscious sister, Pam mumbled something in her sleep. "I helped you. Now take me home, my Romeo." These words were eerily familiar. They were a phrase Nara used to say to Nick in the past. The words struck Nick, filling him with a mix of surprise, confusion, and sadness. Nick placed Pam gently on the ground for a moment and looked around again, hoping to find a way to get help. The desolate area offered no immediate solutions, but he knew he had to get Pam to safety as quickly as possible. Gathering his resolve, he picked her up again and began walking towards the main road, hoping to flag down a passing vehicle or find a way to contact his parents or the police for help. Soon, Nick managed to get his sister back home safely. When his family and relatives learned about what had happened, they were determined to bring the perpetrator to justice. Nick's father, being the village headman, contacted the parents of the senior who was suspected to be the culprit, only to find out that he had gone missing. Nick then remembered the motorcycle parked at the scene and asked his father and others to go back and check the area again. When they arrived at the spot where they had found Pam, the motorcycle was still there, but the owner was nowhere to be seen. They decided to search the vicinity, convinced that the perpetrator must still be around. After a while, they found the senior lying face down, unconscious, with his hands in a praying position as if he was begging for something. Without delay, they turned him over and saw that his body and face were covered in blood. He appeared to have been severely beaten, with his jaw hanging loosely, almost torn off. Near his body, they found a severed piece of flesh. It was the senior's tongue. When everyone managed to capture the perpetrator, they took him to the district hospital. Once he regained consciousness, they realized he had lost his sanity and could no longer speak or provide any testimony. After the incident, Nick rode his motorcycle to Nara's house and said, "I've brought you home as promised, my Juliet." Upon arriving at Nara's house, her grandmother suddenly opened the door and shouted, "Who are you? What are you doing here so late at night?" Nick was puzzled because he was standing alone in front of the house. He called out, "It's me, Nick, Grandma." Recognizing him, she asked what he was doing there, and Nick decided to tell her everything that had happened. The grandmother concluded that it must have been Nara who helped Nick find his sister. Years after the traumatic event, Nick finally learned the full story from his sister, Pam. She recounted that she had met the perpetrator at the market while buying supplies and preparing to return home. The man offered to give her a ride home, and since Pam knew him as Nick Sr. who lived nearby, she trusted him. However, during the ride, the man took a different route, claiming it was a shortcut. When he saw the opportunity, he pulled over and attempted to sexually assault Pam. She fought back with all her might, and in response, he began strangling her to silence her. As Pam struggled and her vision began to fade, she saw a figure standing behind the perpetrator. Upon closer inspection, she realized it was Nara, the older sister she had known well during her childhood. Pam recounted that as she was gasping for breath and feeling completely drained, she suddenly found the strength to fight back. She grabbed the perpetrator's neck, using all her energy to slap and punch him until he eventually fled into the forest. Afterward, Pam lost consciousness and remembered nothing more. She decided to share this story with Nick because she felt that the perpetrator had already received his due punishment. Years passed, and Nick graduated and began working in Bangkok. During a visit home, he met with some old friends. While they were socializing, the conversation turned to past events, including the story of the perpetrator. One of the friends mentioned that after the man lost his sanity, he eventually hanged himself in the same hut where Nara had ended her life. The friend further revealed that the perpetrator had once spied on Nara while she was bathing at her home during a Buddhist religious day when Nara's grandmother was staying at the temple. He had sexually assaulted her and threatened to kill her if she told anyone. After Nara's death, the perpetrator claimed that her spirit frequently appeared to him, sometimes as a physical presence and other times through sounds or scents, causing him sleepless nights for months. Hearing this, Nick finally understood the reason behind Nara's tragic decision, a mystery that had haunted him for over 15 years. He felt profound sorrow for not being able to help her back then, burdened by the regret of not knowing the true cause of her despair.